Check, check. All right, guys, good morning, and thank you all for attending our Introduction to Diesel Basics. We've got a lot of great seminars coming up very soon. I'm sure if you all are obviously clear with how to register for these seminars now, just keep an eye on the newsletters that you get in your email. As you can tell, these classes do fill up, so try to register early. And yeah, so I don't know if you guys have not been to the Tate Westbrook classes. Those things are amazing for navigation, mid-range cruising, things like that. It's very helpful. Just lots of good stuff coming up soon. We do have a sock burning social coming up on March 15th. If you guys are familiar with that, it's a quirky little event that we do this year. We've got a traditional mountain music band that's going to be playing during the sock burning. We do like oysters. And if anybody was here last year and you got to taste Chef Ava's pierogies, she's going to be catering the event, so it's totally worth it. You should come out. Anyway, so for today, we've got Scott Segal here from AR Marine Diesel. He's definitely one of our most recommended mechanics here at the Marina. He's been teaching for 30 years. Well, you've been teaching a mechanic for 30 years. I don't think you can get a more a better speaker than what you've got today. He's done this like, what, 5 times now, I think, right? 4 or 5 times. I learn something new every time. So anyway, enough of my rambling. Thank you guys for coming again today, and I'll turn it over to Scott Segal. So thanks, guys. If you all have any questions about the Marina, just see me after the seminar. I'll be happy to help you out, okay? Thanks, guys.
Good morning. I'll just go back over what you just said a little bit. My name is Scott Segal. I own AR Marine Diesel Service. I've been a professional marine diesel mechanic for over 36 years now. I teach for the diesel courses for the National School of Seamanship. I've been teaching those courses since 2003. And so this is basically the introduction to the basic diesel course that I teach for the National School of Seamanship. So if y'all like what you find here, then you can go to their website and actually sign up for the full 2-day course. And then there's an advanced course also that you can sign up for. All right, let's just jump right into it. All right, this is Rudolph Diesel. So back in 1893, he got the patent for what's known as the compression ignition cycle. And what that is the ability to ignite a fuel with the absence of a spark. And the way that can happen is you take a volume of air, and if you compress that air rapidly, the temperature of that air goes hotter, gets hot. And when that happens, when we inject atomized diesel fuel in that hot environment, it auto ignites. And it's not that we added any heat to that air. Each molecule in that air has a certain amount of heat to it. And then when we pack all those molecules into a tight little space, those molecules start banging into each other, which creates friction. And then when you pack that into a tiny little space, the temperature of that space goes up. And it gets so hot that when we inject atomized fuel in it, that fuel auto ignites. And so he came up with this back in 1893, and for roughly about 100 years, it didn't change a whole lot. I mean, it got more sophisticated and stuff, but it wasn't, no big major change didn't happen until the late 80s, early 90s. In the marine world, we didn't actually see it until the mid-90s, because everything happens in the automotive industry before it happens here in the marine world. And that big change was computers, because the emissions coming out of the diesel engines were dirty, and so the EPA started poking their little fingers into the emissions coming out of the diesel, and then we saw our first computer on an engine. Now, my first contact with a computer was on a John Deere engine, and it was a hybrid. So it was electronically governed, but still mechanically fuel injected. And then it wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s when I saw my first fully electronic engine, which that was a Cummins engine. And so even the injectors are controlled by a computer. And so once you start getting really modern on these engines, there's less and less that you all can do to it. You can still do your oil changes and fuel filters and coolant service, but once it comes to like real troubleshooting, you need to have the laptop to plug into the computer to talk to the computer on the engine. And you can't buy an aftermarket tool to plug into it. You can't buy a Snap-on tool. You can't go to AutoZone and buy some tool to plug in like you can on your car. And so you all then get pushed off to the side, and you got to actually call somebody who actually has that test equipment. But you know, you're gonna have to make that decision, you know, at the time. Okay. So this is the reason most people come and take my class. We got your do-it-yourselfers. We have people that want to speak intelligently with the mechanic. Remember, that might be a one-sided conversation depending on who you're talking to. I've heard some good stories about people going up and down the ICW and breaking down, and all they can do is pull into a farm. And so it's Bubba coming out to give them a hand because Bubba works on tractors. So you may have a computer, or maybe a specialty tool, to remove something and reinstall it. And that tool might be extremely expensive. So you're going to buy that tool for a one-time use, or is it smarter to hire somebody who already has a tool and pay them whatever amount of hours it's required to do the work? And then most people like to be able to handle their own breakdowns and not have to make this phone call. In reality, 90% of the time, this phone call does not have to be made if you have a decent set of spare parts on board and a decent set of tools. 90% of the time, the engine can get up and running, usually within an hour. You'd be surprised how many times we get a phone call, someone's getting towed in, and we go and meet them, and we're off the boat in 15 minutes because it's a little loose wire on the starter that came loose. Typically, if the engine was running perfectly fine when you anchored, and then the next morning nothing happens, more than likely it's probably not a big issue. And then we have people that are untying and not coming back, and so they have to be self-sufficient, so they have to be their own mechanical engineers on board. All right, our objective here is to understand the operating theory of diesel engines as a foundation for proper maintenance and effective troubleshooting and repair. We're going to talk about the components and fire. I'm not sure how far we're going to get on this list because we're only in here for 2 hours, and probably one of the hours is going to be Q&A. We're going to talk about compression ignition, fuel atomization injection, the properties of diesel fuel, and the four-stroke cycle. So we have to talk about fire, because our diesel engine is an internal combustion engine, which means there's a fire inside the cylinders. I didn't bring a whole lot of show and tell besides an engine with me, so I can't hold up a cylinder. But inside of this is a four-cylinder engine, so there's four basically holes in the engine where a piston rides up and down inside. And on top of that piston is where we create the heat, and then we inject the fuel on top of the piston, and we create fire. And so the basis of this engine is based off of fire. So anyone in here with firefighting training? Okay, so you all know this is called the fire triangle. So in order for fire to exist, three components need to be present. So we have to have something to burn, so we have to have fuel. So in this case, it's going to be diesel fuel. We need heat, which is the least obvious out of the three components. Everyone thinks this fire is giving off heat, but it actually requires heat. But you already knew that it required heat because we've all watched survival shows and movies where people are stranded on a beach and they're trying to make their own fires on the beach. And you see them, they cut out a little piece of wood, then they take some dry grass and they put it in the bottom of this little wooden canoe. And then they take the straightest twig they can and they put a little point on the end of it, and they put that down into the little canoe, and they're doing this, or they get the fancy bow, and they're using the string with the bow, and they're twisting that stick, which is rubbing and making friction in that, and they create heat, which, and then eventually they make enough heat, which then the dry grass turns into little embers, and then they can put more grass and make a flame. So they're creating heat to create the fire. Now, we also need air. Now, if you look this up on the internet, it's not going to say air on that side of the triangle. It's going to say O2, oxygen. But our engines are not breathing pure oxygen. Our engines are breathing a mixture of gases, and that mixture of gases, the oxygen content can vary depending on the situation. So I put air here because that oxygen content can vary, which also has it changes the way the engine can run depending on how much oxygen it's getting. So when all three sides of the triangle are balanced, the engine runs smoothly and cleanly, meaning the exhaust coming out of the engine is clean and clear. But when these sides get out of balance, that's when we have byproducts, and that byproduct is smoke. So when you see a diesel engine smoking, typically this is out of balance. Now the first thing we're going to talk about is the air side, because it's usually the easiest to troubleshoot, especially if it's just a naturally aspirated engine. So a naturally aspirated engine is an engine without a turbocharger or supercharger. So this engine here actually has a turbocharger on it. So this has a device that adds extra air once you get over a certain RPM. So the first thing we're going to talk about on the air side, the easiest one to check would be the air filter, if you have an air filter. So this just has a screen on it, so it's not much of a filter, just there to kind of keep the squirrels out. But some engines will have a foam filter. Some engines may have a paper filter, like on your car. And so things that can clog your filters, so you can get belt dust. A lot of engine compartments have soundproofing around it, which is layers of foam. And over time, that foam gets brittle and it disintegrates, and that can get sucked into the filter and clog the filter. And if that happens, then the amount of oxygen being able to get into the cylinder will be less than it was designed for. And so the amount of fuel we're spraying in has to be balanced with the amount of oxygen. And so what happens is, on a molecular level, a fuel molecule has to be in contact with an oxygen molecule for that fuel molecule to burn. So if we don't provide enough oxygen molecules, then the fuel molecules that we're spraying into the cylinder, all of it won't burn because there's not enough oxygen. Now that fuel will still get heated up because we're spraying it into that hot environment, but it won't be able to burn. And so when it gets heated up without the oxygen, it turns to carbon. And so you will see that coming out the back of your boat as black smoke. So black smoke is unburnt fuel that's been heated up. So remember, black smoke, unburnt fuel, which you paid for, and you didn't put it to work. It's literally your money going up in smoke. All right. So that's the air in. But the air also has to leave the engine through the exhaust. Now this is what we call an exhaust mixing elbow. On a lot of engines, this one's stainless steel, but on a lot of engines, this might be a cast iron or cast aluminum, and they have a lot of issues with carbonization, where the carbon running through the exhaust will cling to the metal and then slowly over time start closing off the exhaust passage, so then it won't allow the exhaust to get out of the engine fast enough. And if the exhaust can't get out of the engine fast enough, which means we're not going to be able to get the clean oxygen into the engine quickly enough, because there's no room for it because the exhaust is still there. And so then we don't burn the fuel, we create even more carbon, and then it just slowly, or not slowly, actually starts closing off quicker and quicker and quicker. And so this is on your maintenance schedule to get checked. So everyone should find their operator's manuals for your engines, and then open up your maintenance schedule and start looking at your maintenance schedules, because there's probably a lot of things on it that you don't realize that has to be checked and serviced. Everyone knows that you have to change your oil and change your fuel filters and your impellers and anodes if you have them. A lot of people don't know the mixing elbows need to be checked, injectors need to be checked. There's something that drives your transmission called a damper plate. Your transmission is supposed to come off. Those are supposed to get checked. Your engine motor mounts, they have a certain lifespan. So there's a lot of things that are supposed to get checked that a lot of people may not realize needs to be checked. Also, on the top of the engine, we have valve rocker arms that open and close the valves. Actually, they open the valves, the springs close the valves. But there's a specific clearance that's supposed to be there under the rocker arm and the top of the valve stem. And so for a professional, it's real quick, simple adjustment that has to take place. So it may, depending on the axis to the top of the engine, under an hour on a lot of engines. If you have big 6 cylinders, Sometimes it may be a little more complicated because you have to rotate the engine to get the piston at top dead center, which means the piston's at the very top of the stroke, at the beginning of the power stroke. We haven't gotten to the 4 strokes yet, so bear with me a little bit. All right, so that's the air side. So other things that affect the amount of oxygen in the cylinders, elevation. So if you're boating up in the mountains, higher in elevation you go, the thinner the air, the less oxygen per given volume. But most of us do our boating at sea level, so that's usually not going to be an issue. And if you're below sea level, you usually have other problems like moisture. Unless you're a submarine, I guess. Yeah, so, and then the last item on the air side is the hardest one to troubleshoot. And that's the actual temperature of the air around the engine. So a lot of engine compartments, especially sailboats, the compartment's really small, and this engine's sitting basically in your living room, and you don't want to hear it. So they put sound insulation all around it so you can't hear it, which makes it a great oven. And so the temperature of the compartment can get so hot that the oxygen getting to the cylinders are actually not enough. And so who here has blowers on your boat? When do you use your blower? When you start it? Before you start it? Well, some of them are pre-wired, so as soon as you turn the key on, they automatically kick on. So if you're from the gasoline world, then yeah, you're going to say, I turn it on before I start my engines. Well, on a gas boat, gasoline vapors are explosive. So you run the blower for 10 to 15 minutes before you actually start the engines, because any gas vapors in the compartment, and you crank the engine, the spark happens, then you can actually blow the boat up. But on a diesel engine, the blower's on there for explosive gases. It's there to evacuate heat. So the correct answer is the blower should be running when your engines are running. It's there to evacuate the heat from the compartment. Now, if you looked at where the blower hoses were run in the boat, on a gas boat, the blower hose is going to go as low in the bilge as possible because gasoline vapors sink, and that's where they're going to accumulate, and so they want to evacuate the gas vapors. But on a diesel boat, the blower hose goes to the top of the compartment because hot air rises, and the heat's going to be at the top of the compartment, so we're going to pull the heat off the top of the compartment on a diesel boat. And so in the powerboat world, the 38 to 42 foot boat range is typically where the boat could have had gas engines or diesel engines in it. And so usually those boats were designed for gas boats, so when they build them, that blower hose is going to the bilge, but even they put the diesel option in the boat, for whatever reason, they don't move the blower hose to the top of the compartment. They're still running below the engines, which is not good. All right, so that is the air side. The fuel side of the triangle, there's not a ton that we can deal with, but what we have is we have fuel injectors,